The sun was beating down on the pristine streets of Oak Grove, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see. Moving trucks lined the driveway of number 47, as the new family bustled about carrying boxes and furniture into their dream home. It was a beautiful colonial house with white trim and dark shutters, the kind of place they'd always imagined living in. Mr. and Mrs. J, along with their 2 kids, had been saving for years for this moment. The kids were already racing up and down the stairs, calling dibs on bedrooms, while their mom directed the movers with military precision. Their dad, meanwhile, was in the garage, organizing boxes with a quiet smile on his face. He hadn't told anyone in the neighborhood about his new job yet. He was set to become the city's new police chief in just a few weeks. As they unpacked, curious eyes peeked through nearby windows. Oak Grove wasn't used to much change, and the arrival of the first black family in the neighborhood had certainly stirred up attention. Some neighbors waved hesitantly from their porches, while others quickly drew their curtains shut when noticed. "Look at this kitchen," Mrs. J exclaimed, running her hands along the granite countertops. "Can you imagine the family dinners we'll have here?" Their old apartment's kitchen had barely fit 2 people, but this one was spacious enough for their whole extended family. The previous owners had left it spotless, with modern appliances that made Mrs. G's eyes sparkle with excitement. Their teenage daughter was already plotting where to put her study desk in her new room, while their younger son had discovered the backyard's potential for his soccer practice. The yard was bigger than any they'd had before, with a wooden deck that seemed perfect for outdoor gatherings. Mr. G watched his family's excitement with quiet satisfaction. After 15 years on the force, working his way up from beat cop to detective, and now to chief, he'd finally been able to give his family the home they deserved. He hadn't wanted to announce his new position right away. He believed in letting people form their opinions without titles getting in the way. As the afternoon wore on, more boxes found their homes, and rooms slowly started taking shape. The living room couch was positioned just right. Family photos were carefully arranged on the mantel, and their son's soccer trophies proudly displayed on his new shelves. The house was beginning to feel like home. "Hey, honey," Mrs. J called out to her husband, "what do you think about having a family BBQ this weekend?" You know Kristen, the new place properly. She was already thinking about having the whole family over. Uncles, aunts, cousins, and all. Her husband's famous ribs and her mother's secret recipe potato salad would be the perfect way to break in their new home. Mr. G grinned, already imagining the smell of his signature BBQ sauce wafting through the neighborhood. "That's exactly what this place needs," he agreed, looking out at their new deck. "We'll do it right. Music, food, family. Show this neighborhood how we celebrate." As the moving truck pulled away and the sun began to set, the family sat on their new front porch, sharing a pizza and dreams about their future in Oak Grove. They didn't know it yet, but their simple family BBQ would soon become the talk of the town, though not for the reasons they expected. Little did they know that their next-door neighbor was already forming opinions about her new neighbors, opinions that would lead to quite an interesting turn of events. The weekend arrived quicker than expected, and the morning sun found Mrs. G up early, already marinating the chicken while her husband prepared his special dry rub for the ribs. The kitchen was alive with the sounds of chopping and mixing, the counters covered with fresh vegetables and seasonings. "Did you call your sister?" Mrs. G asked, looking up from the massive bowl of potato salad she was preparing. "You know she'll bring those amazing corn muffins everyone loves." Her husband nodded, grinning as he mixed his secret blend of spices. The recipe had been passed down from his grandfather, and it was always the star of their family gatherings. By noon, the backyard was transformed. They'd set up folding tables covered in bright tablecloths, strung lights across the deck, and positioned chairs in comfortable clusters around the yard. Their son was helping his dad set up the new grill, while their daughter arranged flowers in mason jars as centerpieces. "The neighbors might think we're opening a restaurant back here," their son joked, watching smoke start to curl up from the grill. The rich, sweet smell of BBQ began to drift through the air. making their mouths water. It wasn't long before they noticed curtains twitching in nearby windows and curious faces peeking over fences. Around 2 o'clock, cars started pulling up. Aunts, uncles, and cousins poured out, arms loaded with covered dishes and desserts. The quiet suburban streets suddenly came alive with laughter and warm greetings. Their aunt brought her famous mac and cheese, still bubbling hot, while cousins carried in homemade pies and cakes. The music started playing, old school R&B mixed with current hits, kept at a respectful volume, but loud enough to set the mood. The kids started a game of tag in the yard, while the adults gathered around the grill, sharing stories and jokes. It was exactly the kind of family gathering they dreamed of having in their new home. "This potato salad is incredible," one cousin exclaimed, going back for seconds. "And these ribs, Uncle, you've outdone yourself." The compliments kept flowing as plate after plate was filled and emptied. The atmosphere was perfect, that magical mix of good food, family love, and summer warmth. But not everyone was enjoying the festivities. Next door, their neighbor kept pacing back and forth behind her curtains, phone in hand. She'd been watching since the first car arrived, her frown deepening with each new guest. The sound of children's laughter and family joy seemed to irritate her more by the minute. "Look at all this food," their aunt exclaimed, surveying the spread. Just like the old days when Grandma would host Sunday dinners. The comment brought smiles and nostalgic sighs from the older family members who remembered those gatherings. They were creating new memories now, in this beautiful new space, continuing traditions that had sustained their family for generations. As the afternoon wore on, more food appeared, more stories were shared, and more laughter echoed through the yard. The kids had moved on to a water balloon fight, careful to stay away from the food tables. Their daughter was showing her cousins her new room, while their son demonstrated his soccer tricks for the younger kids. Nobody noticed their neighbor's increasingly agitated behavior, or saw her finally punch numbers into her phone with trembling fingers. They were too busy enjoying each other's company, celebrating their new home, and creating memories that would be talked about at family gatherings for years to come. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the gathering, when the first police car quietly turned onto their street. The family celebration was about to take an unexpected turn, though not in the way their neighbor had planned. The next-door neighbor, Mrs. Daw, had been watching the BBQ for hours through her living room window, getting more agitated by the minute. She'd moved to Oak Grove 20 years ago for its quiet charm, and she wasn't about to let that change. Her fingers drummed nervously on her phone as she paced back and forth. "This is just too much," she muttered to herself, pulling her curtains aside for the 100th time. The sight of children playing and families laughing somehow made her even more determined. She'd already called the Homeowners Association twice, but they hadn't been helpful at all. "If they won't do anything about it, I know who will." Her hands shaking slightly, she dialed the police non-emergency number. "Yes, hello," she said in a hushed voice, as if someone might hear her through her closed windows. "I need to report a disturbance in my neighborhood. There's a large group of suspicious individuals gathering next door. They're being very loud, and I'm concerned about the safety of our community." The dispatcher's voice was professional but neutral. "Can you describe the nature of the disturbance, ma'am?" "Well," Mrs. Dully hesitated, realizing she needed to make it sound more serious. "There's loud music and dozens of people coming and going. I've never seen any of them in the neighborhood before. They're having some kind of party, and it's not the kind of thing we usually have around here, if you know what I mean." Meanwhile, back at the BBQ, everyone was still enjoying themselves, completely unaware of the call being made. Mr. Jew was showing his nephew how to check if the ribs were done, sharing the grilling wisdom passed down through generations. "See how the meat starts pulling back from the bone? That's how you know they're perfect." Mrs. G was sitting with her sisters on the deck, watching the kids play and catching up on family news. The afternoon light was golden, and the smell of BBQ still filled the air. Someone had just brought out a fresh peach cobbler, and the kids were gathering around, hoping to be first in line for dessert. Mrs. W continued her surveillance, now standing on her tiptoes to peer over the fence. She saw people laughing, eating, children playing, but in her mind, she was convinced this was somehow threatening. She made 3 more calls to the police, each time trying to make the situation sound more urgent than it was. "I really think you need to send someone quickly," she insisted during her last call. "The crowd is getting bigger, and the noise is just unbearable." In reality, the gathering was actually starting to wind down, with some of the older relatives beginning to pack up their empty dishes and say their goodbyes. The dispatcher, growing somewhat weary of the repeated calls, finally assured her that officers would be sent to check on the situation. Mrs. W felt triumphant, imagining how the police would break up the party and restore what she considered order to her quiet street. She positioned herself by her front window, waiting eagerly for the police to arrive. In her mind, she rehearsed what she would say when they came to take her statement. She was sure they would thank her for being such a vigilant neighbor, for protecting the neighborhood's character. Back at the BBQ, Mr. G was just about to announce that the last batch of ribs was ready when his brother-in-law, who had been checking his phone, looked up with an amused expression. "Hey," he said quietly, "you might want to know that someone's called the police about our little gathering." Multiple times, apparently. Mr. G raised an eyebrow, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had a pretty good idea who might have made those calls, and he couldn't help but think about how interesting the next few minutes were going to be. As if on cue, a police cruiser turned slowly onto their street, its lights off, but its presence unmistakable. Mrs. W straightened her shirt and smoothed her hair, ready to greet the officers who would surely want her detailed account of the disturbance. She had no idea that the next few moments would completely change her understanding of her new neighbors and teach her a lesson she'd never forget. The police cruiser pulled up slowly, and 2 officers stepped out. They were young officers, both looking somewhat uncomfortable with the situation. The smell of delicious BBQ hit them immediately, and they could hear children's laughter mixed with soft music in the background. It definitely didn't match the disturbing situation they'd been called about. Mrs. W burst out of her front door before the officers could even reach the sidewalk. "Oh, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, rushing toward them. "I've been calling about this situation for hours." She gestured dramatically toward her neighbor's yard. The older of the 2 officers, trying to maintain his professional demeanor, began to speak. "Ma'am, we received calls about a disturbance." He stopped mid-sentence as he caught sight of Mr. G's brother-in-law approaching the front yard. The officer's face broke into a wide grin. "Detective, what are you doing here?" the officer called out. Mr. G's brother-in-law, a respected detective from the neighboring precinct, walked over with a plate of ribs in his hand. "Officers, perfect timing. We've got plenty of food left. Come on back. There's someone you should meet." Mrs. W stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as the officers followed the detective toward the backyard. This wasn't going according to her plan at all. She trailed behind them, determined to make her complaints heard. As they rounded the corner to the backyard, Mr. G was standing by the grill, spatula in hand. The younger officer's eyes widened in recognition. He'd just attended the department meeting last week where Mr. G had been introduced as their incoming police chief. "Chief," both officers exclaimed almost simultaneously. The younger one nearly stumbled over his own feet. "We received some calls about a disturbance," he stammered, his face reddening. Mrs. W, who had finally caught up, stopped dead in her tracks. "Chief," she squeaked. Her face went from righteous anger to shock in an instant. The word hung in the air like the BBQ smoke. Mr. G smiled warmly. "Officers, glad you could join us. My family's just helping us break in the new house." He gestured to the gathering around him. "Would you like some ribs? My grandfather's recipe. Been in the family for generations." The officers looked at each other, then at their watches. "Well, sir, we should probably get back to patrol," the older one began, but Mr. G was already making them plates. "Take some back to the station," he insisted. "There's plenty. And please, tell everyone at the precinct they're welcome to stop by. We're going to be doing this regularly. Building community relationships is going to be a big focus when I take over next month." Mrs. W stood rooted to the spot, her face growing redder by the second. The realization was slowly sinking in. She had spent the afternoon calling the police on her new police chief. Her mind raced back through all the things she'd said on those calls, all the implications she'd made. The officers accepted their plates with thanks, trying hard not to smile too obviously at the situation. They'd heard the tone of the complaints that had come in, and the irony wasn't lost on them. "Everything appears to be in order here," the older officer said professionally, though his eyes twinkled with amusement. "Just a family BBQ. Nothing to be concerned about, ma'am," he added, looking directly at Mrs. W. As the officers prepared to leave, enjoying their plates of ribs, Mrs. G approached Mrs. W with a warm smile. "Would you like to join us? There's plenty of food, and we'd love to get to know our neighbors better." The kindness in her voice made Mrs. W feel even smaller. The entire backyard had gone quiet, all eyes on Mrs. W as she stood there, her carefully constructed complaints crumbling around her. She had a choice to make, one that would define her relationship with her new neighbors for years to come. Mrs. W stood there, her face burning with embarrassment, as the weight of what she'd done crashed down around her. The plastic smile she'd worn for the police officers had melted away, replaced by a look of pure mortification. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I didn't know," she finally managed to stammer, her voice barely above a whisper. The plate of food Mrs. J was offering her seemed to float there between them, a peace offering she wasn't sure she deserved. The rich smell of BBQ sauce only made the situation feel more surreal. From the corner of her eye, she could see other neighbors starting to gather at their fences, drawn by the police presence, but staying to witness the unfolding scene. Some had their phones out, barely even trying to hide the fact that they were recording. Tomorrow, she realized, everyone would know what she'd done. Mr. G stepped forward, his presence somehow both authoritative and gentle. "You know what," he said, keeping his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "In my 20 years on the force, I've learned that the best way to handle misunderstandings is to talk about them. Over good food, preferably." Their daughter, who had been watching everything unfold, suddenly piped up from near the dessert table. "Dad, can I get Mrs. W some of Aunt's peach cobbler? It's really good." The innocence of the child's offer seemed to break some of the tension in the air. Mrs. W felt tears welling up in her eyes. She looked around at the family gathering. Really looked, perhaps for the first time. She saw grandparents sharing stories with grandchildren, teenagers helping younger kids with their plates, adults laughing over shared memories. It was exactly the kind of family gathering she used to have, before she'd lost her own husband 3 years ago. I'd like that," she said quietly, accepting the plate from Mrs. J with trembling hands. "And I think I owe everyone an apology." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. A chair appeared behind her, offered by one of the cousins, and Mrs. J gently guided her to sit. The family naturally shifted to include her in their circle, the way families do when someone new joins the gathering. No judgment, just acceptance. "These ribs really are amazing," she admitted after her first bite, a small smile finally breaking through her tears. "My late husband used to grill too, but I haven't had homemade BBQ since." She trailed off, but Mr. G's aunt just patted her hand understandingly. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, the police officers who had remained chatting with Mr. G finally headed back to their patrol car, each carrying containers of leftover food for their colleagues at the station. They gave Mrs. W a friendly nod as they left, all earlier awkwardness forgotten. Other neighbors, who had been watching from a distance, slowly began approaching the yard. Some brought dishes of their own, a spontaneous gesture of community that seemed to say they wanted to be part of this moment, this healing. "You know," Mrs. W said softly to Mrs. J as they watched more neighbors arriving. I think I've learned more in the last hour than I have in the last 20 years living here. She paused, looking down at her empty plate. Would it be okay if I brought my sweet potato pie to the next gathering? The moment hung in the air, full of possibility. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into something else entirely. A chance for real change, not just in one person, but in an entire neighborhood. The evening had become more than just a family BBQ. It was turning into a lesson about judgment, forgiveness, and the power of sharing a meal together. As the evening continued, Mrs. W found herself sharing stories about her own life with her new neighbors. She told them about growing up in a small town, about her late husband's famous chili cook-offs, and about how lonely the big house next door had felt since he passed away. With each story, the walls she'd built around herself seemed to crumble a little more. You remind me so much of my mother, one of Mr. G's aunts said warmly, passing her another piece of peach cobbler. She always said food brings people together better than anything else. Mrs. W found herself nodding, thinking about how different this evening had turned out from what she'd expected. The kids had taken to calling her Grandma Dulu already, showing her their soccer moves and asking if she'd judge their upcoming cannonball contest in the pool next weekend. Their pure, uncomplicated acceptance of her made the adults' eyes misty. Mr. G stood up, gently tapping his glass to get everyone's attention. The yard fell quiet, the string lights overhead casting a warm glow over the gathered faces. I want to say something, he began, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of law enforcement experience. Today, we've all witnessed something pretty special. He looked around at the mix of faces, his family, the neighbors who'd joined them, and Mrs. W. When I took this job as police chief, I had a vision of building bridges in our community. I just didn't expect to start in my own backyard. A gentle laugh rippled through the crowd. Mrs. W felt her face flush, but Mr. G wasn't done. What happened today? This right here, this is what community looks like. Not calling the police on each other, but talking to each other, breaking bread together, understanding each other. Their daughter tugged at Mrs. W's sleeve. Can you teach me how to make sweet potato pie? She whispered loudly, making everyone chuckle. Mrs. W found herself wiping away tears again, but this time they were different tears. I'd love to, she replied, then looked up at the gathering. And maybe we could make this a regular thing. I mean, my backyard is just sitting there empty, and it's been too quiet since. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood. The neighbors who had joined later in the evening were already planning the next gathering. Someone suggested a block party. Another person mentioned starting a community garden. Ideas flew back and forth, the excitement building with each suggestion. Mr. G's brother-in-law, the detective, pulled him aside with a grin. You know, Chief, this isn't exactly what I expected when you said you wanted to improve community relations. They both watched as Mrs. W showed Mrs. J pictures of her garden on her phone, the two women already planning a flower-sharing arrangement. The sun had fully set now, and more string lights had been turned on, creating a magical atmosphere. Someone had started playing soft jazz music, and couples were swaying gently on the makeshift dance floor near the grill. You know what's funny? Mrs. W said to Mrs. J as they cleaned up some plates together. I was so worried about property values going down when you moved in. Now I'm thinking they might go up, not because of what you have, but because of what you bring to the neighborhood. Little did anyone know that this evening would become legendary in Oak Grove. Years later, people would still talk about the BBQ that changed everything. How one misunderstanding, handled with grace and forgiveness, transformed not just a neighborhood, but the people in it. As the last guests began to leave, hugs were exchanged instead of polite waves. Plans were made instead of complaints filed. And Mrs. W found herself walking back to her house with a container of leftover ribs, 3 new phone numbers in her contacts, and something she hadn't felt in years. The weeks following the BBQ brought changes to Oak Grove that nobody could have predicted. It started small. Mrs. W leaving fresh flowers on the J family's doorstep with a handwritten note. The next day, Mrs. J dropped off a container of leftover lasagna at Mrs. W's house, knowing she lived alone. Word of what happened that evening spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, but not in the way Mrs. W had feared. Instead of ridicule, she found herself receiving unexpected support. Other neighbors started sharing their own stories of times they'd made wrong assumptions or rushed to judgment. The local coffee shop became a hub of activity as neighbors who had lived next to each other for years finally started having real conversations. "You know," one elderly resident said over his morning coffee, "I've lived here for 30 years, and this is the first time I've seen people actually talking to each other instead of about each other." Mr. G's influence as the new police chief was already being felt. He started walking the neighborhood in civilian clothes, chatting with residents and learning their concerns. Children would wave excitedly when they saw him, and he always had time to watch their bike tricks or admire their chalk drawings. Mrs. W surprised everyone by volunteering to help Mrs. G organize the neighborhood's first community potluck. "I used to do event planning, you know," she admitted sheepishly, "before I retired and became the neighborhood watch instead of the neighborhood welcome wagon." The transformation in Mrs. W was remarkable. Her curtains, once perpetually drawn, were now open to let in the sunlight. Her front porch, previously empty, now sported comfortable chairs where she would sit and chat with passing neighbors. She even started a weekly coffee morning for the neighborhood's elderly residents who, like her, lived alone. One morning, while helping the G's daughter practice for her school presentation, Mrs. W found herself looking at old photos of neighborhood events from 20 years ago. "We used to do so much together," she explained to the curious child. "Somehow, we just stopped. We got so caught up in protecting what we had that we forgot about sharing it." The J family's backyard became a regular gathering spot for impromptu weekend cookouts. Mr. G would fire up the grill, and neighbors would drift over with dishes to share and stories to tell. Children played together regardless of which house they came from, their laughter a constant soundtrack to the neighborhood's new rhythm. Even the local police officers got involved in the community's transformation. They'd stop by during their patrols, not to respond to calls, but to join in quick conversations or grab a cookie from Mrs. W's seemingly endless supply. "The chief's changing how we do things," one officer explained. "It's not just about enforcing the law, it's about being part of the community." The Neighborhood Watch program, once focused on reporting suspicious activity, was reimagined as a community support network. Instead of calling the police about unfamiliar faces, neighbors now introduced themselves. When new families moved in, they were greeted with welcome baskets and invitations to the next community gathering. Mrs. W found herself becoming the unofficial neighborhood grandmother. She taught cooking classes to the local kids, shared gardening tips with new homeowners, and always had an extra chair on her porch for anyone who needed to talk. "I spent so many years watching life happen through my window," she reflected one evening. "Now I'm finally living it." The story of the BBQ and its aftermath became a teaching moment at the police academy, where Mr. G would sometimes share it during his community relations lectures. Sometimes, he would tell the cadets, the biggest changes start with the smallest misunderstandings, if we're brave enough to face them with an open heart. As months passed, Oak Grove became known as the neighborhood that got it right. News spread about how a simple BBQ had sparked a community transformation, and local TV stations started requesting interviews. But the residents, led by Mr. J and Mrs. W, politely declined. "Some stories are better told through actions than words," Mr. G would say with a smile. The changes went far beyond just friendly waves and shared meals. When old Mrs. Thompson down the street broke her hip, the neighborhood rallied. A schedule was created for bringing her meals, mowing her lawn, and driving her to physical therapy. Mrs. W coordinated it all from her front porch command center, her phone constantly buzzing with neighbors offering to help. The J family's teenage daughter started a tutoring program in their basement, where neighborhood kids would gather after school. Mrs. W would always make sure there were fresh cookies and lemonade, saying that studying works better with snacks. The children's test scores started improving, and parents noticed their kids were more confident and engaged. One rainy Saturday, the neighborhood came together for what they called the Great Garage Cleanout. Everyone opened their garages, sharing tools, books, and furniture with neighbors who could use them. "Why should we all buy new lawn mowers when we can share?" someone suggested, and soon a tool-sharing program was born. The police department noticed a dramatic drop in calls from Oak Grove. Instead of complaints about noise or suspicious persons, the rare calls were for genuine emergencies, and even then, neighbors had usually already stepped in to help before officers arrived. Mr. G's approach to community policing became a model for other precincts. Officers were encouraged to attend neighborhood events, play basketball with local kids, and really get to know the residents they served. "It's harder to fear what you understand," he would tell his officers during briefings. The neighborhood children started a tradition of their own. Every Sunday afternoon, they would gather in different backyards for what they called family fun time. Parents would watch in amazement as kids of all ages played together, older ones looking out for younger ones, no one left out or excluded. Mrs. W found herself busier than she'd been in years. Between her cooking classes, garden club, and weekly coffee mornings, her calendar was full. But it was her front porch talks that became legendary. Anyone having a tough time knew they could stop by, sit in one of her comfortable chairs, and find a sympathetic ear. The local elementary school principal noticed the change too. Bullying incidents decreased, and parent participation increased. "Something special is happening in Oak Grove," she said during a school board meeting. "The children are learning what real community looks like." One evening, as neighbors gathered for their now regular Sunday dinner in the G's backyard, someone suggested writing down their story. Not for the news or for fame, but for future residents. "So they'll know how this all started," Mrs. W said, "and how one misunderstanding turned into understanding." They hung a large map of the neighborhood in the community center, and everyone added pictures and notes about acts of kindness they'd witnessed. It became a living document of their transformation, growing larger and more colorful each week. Even the local businesses felt the change. The coffee shop started hosting monthly neighbor nights where residents could share their talents. Poetry readings, music performances, art shows. The owner said his business had doubled, not because of marketing, but because people wanted to be part of the community. The most remarkable change was in the faces of the residents. The stressed, suspicious looks had been replaced by genuine smiles. People walked slower, talked longer, and listened better. They had rediscovered something precious: the joy of belonging to a real community. One year after the famous BBQ incident, Oak Grove gathered for an anniversary celebration. The entire neighborhood had come together in the community park, with tables groaning under the weight of everyone's favorite dishes. Mr. G was at his usual spot behind the grill, while Mrs. W supervised the dessert table, making sure everyone got a piece of her now famous sweet potato pie. "Would you believe it's been a year?" Mrs. W said to Mrs. J as they set up the tables. "Sometimes I wake up thinking it was all a dream." She paused, watching the children playing on the grass. "Then I hear those kids laughing, and I remember it's real." The celebration wasn't just about good food and company, though there was plenty of both. It was about acknowledging how far they'd come. The police department's community relations program, inspired by Oak Grove's transformation, had been adopted by 3 neighboring cities. Crime rates had dropped, not because of increased policing, but because neighbors looked out for each other. Mr. G stood up to make a speech, but this time, Mrs. W joined him. The crowd fell silent, remembering how different things had been a year ago. "I want to tell you all something," Mrs. W began, her voice shaking slightly. "A year ago, I was the neighborhood witch, the one who called the police on a family BBQ." She paused, looking around at the faces she now knew so well. I was scared of change, scared of different, scared of losing what I thought made this neighborhood special. Her eyes met Mr. G's, and he nodded encouragingly. But you know what? I was wrong about what made this place special. It wasn't about keeping things the same. It was about growing together. The G's daughter ran up and hugged Mrs. Doty's legs, making everyone laugh. The little girl had become like a granddaughter to her, spending afternoons baking cookies and learning family recipes. And sometimes, Mrs. Doty continued, patting the child's head, the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. Mr. G took his turn to speak. When we moved here, we hoped to find a home. What we found was so much more. He gestured to the gathered crowd. We found a community willing to learn and grow. We found neighbors willing to become family. The celebration continued into the evening, with string lights twinkling overhead and music floating through the air. Someone had set up a projector showing photos from the past year, community cleanup days, holiday celebrations, impromptu block parties, and countless small moments of neighbors helping neighbors. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Deliu found herself sitting with the G family, watching the neighborhood children chase fireflies. You know, she said quietly, I spent years trying to protect this neighborhood from change. But change was exactly what we needed. The evening ended with a surprise announcement. The city council had recognized Oak Grove's transformation and was using it as a model for other neighborhoods. They were starting a community outreach program, and they wanted Mr. J and Mrs. W to help lead it. From enemies to partners, Mrs. J teased them, making both laugh. Who would have thought? As people began heading home, carrying empty dishes and happy hearts, Mrs. W looked around at her neighborhood, really looked. The same houses stood there, the same streets wound through them, but everything was different. The fences that had once divided them now connected them, with gates left open for children to run through and neighbors to visit. Sometimes, she said to no one in particular, the best things in life start with being wrong about something. She picked up her empty pie dish and headed home, stopping several times to chat with neighbors, hug children, and make plans for tomorrow. The story of the BBQ that changed everything became part of Oak Grove's identity. But more than that, it became a reminder that community isn't about walls and fences. It's about the courage to break them down, one misunderstanding at a time.